Today we're here with SK Malveaux, creator of MusicMaker. How are you doing?
I'm doing spiffy. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. So, with your book, I love the idea and execution of MusicMaker because it seems to go beyond either comics or music with kind of a complete immersion of both. Your work seems to have a deep kind of reflection or a deep connection, I should say, with both. Kind of what gave you the idea to base your story and pacing on music?
Um, First of all, I've always been a big musical fan. I mean, a lot of people are musical fans, but I mean, I've been a professional musical fanboy essentially for since from my teens onward. And it's been one of those funny things that I've had a lot of friends who were musicians, but I've never had that kind of gift myself. So it's always been something that's been mysterious to me in a sense because I'm like, oh wow, this is something so cool and it resonates with me so much, but I have no artistic talent towards it whatsoever. And I do know the one thing that and I've talked to some of my friends who are musicians and some of them who've even contributed to the comic book, which I'll get to that in a second. Um it takes a certain level of fanaticism to get right. I mean, all of all of art takes a certain level of obnoxious dedication to it and everything to get the final product done. But music is one of those things where you have to be playing the same. Sometimes it's the same four notes over and over and over again. Then well, maybe the last one is higher. Okay, maybe the second to last one is a bit lower. Okay, well that's not working. Okay, let's play it over and over and over. It requires this level of OCD, which is kind of like it's something that I've never taken to, but I've always been in awe of. So, so the actual opportunity to be able to not only give my friends who are such both avid musicians and such talented musicians the opportunity to be incorporated into something that is gradually over the past 10 or 15 years become more and more mainstream, which is comic book art and writing, giving them the opportunity to add their talents to something that is traditionally has not been a sound based medium. Getting the opportunity to give them, that opportunity to be like, okay, well, hey, you know, as a musician, do you want to be in a comic book? I don't think that's really happened, not that I've been aware of before. So getting the opportunity to like talk to my idols who have been also my friends and get to elevate their art form as high as I possibly can has been a real blessing and a real pleasure for me.
In your style of storytelling, you seem to be heavily influenced by Aeon Flux. I guess what inspired you about that biopunk type show?
Peter Chung has always been one of my heroes, even whenever I was starting in, believe it or not, I studied visual arts in school, even though I'm actually writing for a comic. Peter Chung's concept between that and another thing that I guess maybe a lot of people don't know is that he also did Rugrats. And his biggest thing whenever he did the
Really?
departure, yes, that he's the same guy who did both of those. And it's like it's one of those things where you're like, wait, wait, what? What? That but his reasoning behind that was that and it was such a visual arts kind of answer to it because he said he wanted more elongated limbs, he wanted more versatility with movement, which I thought was really cool because it made me think of like art forms like dance and various forms of choreography, even stage fighting and things like that. And ways you can push and pull the human anatomy that you didn't necessarily. I mean, it's not. I don't even know how to describe it and everything aside from the fact that it was just the way he described the fact that he went from Rugrats, which was all of these little kind of not necessarily stocky, but very thin, short
Hmm.
little limbs and everything, and awkwardly moving. And what's so great about Rugrats? And then went from that to Aeon Flux, which was, I mean, both are like incredible art forms in their own right, but you would never in a million years attribute them to the same artist. So that's what drew me to it. It was just that it was the flexibility of doing everything that you could with the human form that there was to do.
As far as the writing goes, in this day and age, I mean, the culture seems to have led to some extent by people who see themselves as the loners, the weirdos. Do you believe that indie comics have increased society's like tolerance of these outsiders, or not?
I don't even know if we definitely have increased the tolerance, but I don't know if we can necessarily be said, "Hey everyone, this is McWagger. This is my team mascot and he's going away now." Anyway, so but back to your question about weirdos who like may necessarily talk to their dogs or name their dogs after cute little puns.
Hey, I love it. That's an awesome name for a dog.
Thank you. Anyway, no, like I like to think that indie comics are the reason that the outsiders have gotten more mainstream. I think the fact that you couldn't have Deadpool's or John Constantine's without, and I realize those are two drastically different ends of the spectrum, but they're both, to my way of thinking, anti-heroes. They're not the typical clean cut, doing good for good's sake kind of characters. And they've been so much of an influence on my work. Um, Indie comics, we get the blessing and the curse of being the fact that we don't have some, you know, big force behind us and everything. We can
Hmm.
experiment more. We can talk about things that don't necessarily don't necessarily get to be talked about. And yeah, like I think all of the great anti-heroes especially, and all the great, weirdos of comics, like my comics growing up were and I took such pride in this, was the fact that I loved the Tick and the Mask. And I loved and I love the Max too. I like the Max couldn't
Hmm.
be like, like even looking back at it now, I'm like, whoa, okay. I was looking at that when I was like, how? Well, okay, yeah. You know,
Yeah.
clearly, I was not a Superman, Batman girl kind of comic book reader, but yeah, I think it's like, I think the beautiful thing about like indie comics, or like comics that are starting from like the recesses of creativity and everything, bring a lot of people together who normally wouldn't realize that, oh, by the way, there are more people in the world who are thinking in new and creative and really different ways. So yeah, I mean,
Okay.
yeah.
So kind of back to the music aspect of it. You mentioned that, sometimes you're just listening to these four notes over and over again. Are there certain beats or compositions that you would listen to in order to write your story?
There are definite artists, because like I said, I'm not enough of a musician. I'm not a musician at all. Tried I tried keyboard for a while and everything, and that was just a awful, bloody, horrible virus disaster. But
It couldn't
but
be that bad. Come on.
oh man, like my keyboard just spontaneously exploded. It was terrible. It was embarrassing. But um, anyway, that being said, no, there are definitely some artists, and it's the more esoteric the artists become, the more pride I seem to take in their artwork and finding their artwork, and B, the more interesting and more influential they become. Like uh RIP David Bowie is probably one of the bigger influences on not only the way that my central character Judah Morley looks and an axe in a lot of ways, but also the kind of style of music that I felt would be um, playing to his character. And that's one thing that, especially whenever you're writing, almost every single writer I've ever spoken to, whenever we talk about, okay, well, what's your ultimate writer's playlist? We all have one. We all have one, and sometimes we have multiple ones. It's like, okay, well, I'm writing this. Well, then I'm listening to it's David Bowie, Adamant. It's going to be listening to The Doors or something like that whenever I need it to sound a certain way. And then there's also when you need it to sound a completely different way, or you're writing for a specific character. Well, what would that character listen to? What would they feel? What would they be thinking of in terms of colors, or would it be the artists or things like that? Yeah, it is a heavy influence on, especially when you're writing individual characters and you're trying to get into characters' heads who are drastically different from one another.
Okay. So is that a playlist that you would actually your writer's playlist? Is that something you would actually share with the artist in order to get them in kind of the same headspace as you, or do you just let them do their thing and take a
Not
step
nec-
back on that
not
aspect?
necessarily. Not necessarily. My way of writing is drastically different. Like, I found out recently, I read an article about Neil Gaiman and Alan Moore. The two, you know,
Hmm.
demigods of
They are the
well, yeah,
they make
they're,
up
they're
the
good.
pantheon.
They're good.
Yeah.
They're good. They got this. Okay, they're good. But yeah, whenever I was reading about, like, the level of detail that they gave to their artists, I didn't get a chance to read what Neil Gaiman's was, but Alan Moore, I remember hearing and read a few lines about it and everything. I can't remember where it was, so I can't cite this, but
Hmm.
um he was incredibly detailed about what he wanted the artist to see and to feel, and what he wanted that character to be experiencing, everything. And on the one hand, that's incredibly good. That is like depending on the artist, it cuts out the middleman of, like, okay, well, would they want it to be more ethereal? Would they want it to be more literal? Do they want it to be gritty? Do they want it to be, yeah. But my approach has always been it's been a light touch. It's always been a very, very, very light touch, in the sense that I want the artist to be an artist. I don't want, I mean, there are certain things it's like, okay, well, he has to say this, and he has to be turning this way, and he has to be saying it in a forceful way to this other character, and this other character has to be reacting a certain way. That's about as far as I go, as far as, like, detail and things like that. There are other writers who get immensely detailed, and depending on the
Hmm.
artist that they're working with, that's the best dynamic that can possibly exist. Um, but yeah, as far as me, I like to give it a light touch, because honestly, I want to be a little surprised by what I find. I want to be giving, like, I want to give a lot of rope and everything, not enough for the artist to hang themselves with, but I want to be giving them a lot of room to be the creative person that they are. Again, sometimes that works really great for some artists, and sometimes they need more detail. So but yeah, my personal writing style is, yeah, like, let them go loose, let them be creative.
Okay. Now, can you actually talk a little bit about breaking into comics with this? I don't know how else to word it, but rhythmic journey through Music Maker.
That's nice. Okay, so um breaking into it, good grief, it was just like, okay, so I'd written a few things, I've published a few things, and after a while, I came up with this idea for someone who could, I think the original concept was someone who could use um sound and music as a form of as a power, that they could do that sort of
Hmm.
thing. Because the thing that struck me as being really interesting about it was the fact that when you're doing writing and when you're doing arts, which I'm going to solely focus on the writing at this point. When you're doing writing is a soundless art form. There's nothing to it. There's the voice in your head when you're reading the books, and then there's the writer's voice, and that's about it. And a lot of that is subjective. But then the more I was like writing this character, and a few of these I had a few ideas in my head and everything. I was, going through and seeing which ones would make for a book, which ones would make for this, just getting the job done. And I came across this character, and the character was really, fun and really interesting, and the kind of person who, if you met them in day-to-day life, you would punch them in the face because you'd be so irritated by their personality. But from a third person perspective, they were incredibly charming and alluring. And so I was like, okay, well, what can I have him do? And I was like going over this concept of like, this musical superpower and how interesting that would be from a writing standpoint. And the more and more I did it, the more I realized, wow, this is an interesting concept, but this would be about a million times better if it was like a visual, as well as, the writing aspect, as well as, possibly the musical aspect. And yeah, that's where it stood. Just this idea of just, well, how can we take these two art forms that never intersect and get them to work together? And then that was the basis of what this was about and everything. And my breaking into it was just being too stubborn to let it go and not waiting to hear, not waiting to hear like a proper reply from people and being like, okay, well, I'm not, I think this has some merit. Let's see if we can make this work. And that's where it went from there.
I love that, the blending of the two. Now, we've actually talked to other creators in the past. You happen to be the first one, most notably like Spectacular Stash and TCT Comics, that they are heavily influenced by music as well. What is it about blending music and comics that just works so well?
I think especially now because I don't want to say because it's become mainstream and everything. People who have been passionate about comics have always been passionate about comics. There's just something about, looking into connecting as either a person who has aspirations of writing or a person who has aspirations of visual arts and things like that. Those things somehow connected. And then and I'm quoting someone who I actually interviewed with and everything. His exact words were, "I like comic books because I don't like to read." And I was like, "Thank you." But the point is,
as a writer, that's gotta kind of hit you.
But as a writer, that was just like, oh,
but at the same time, if you think about it this way, they can love comics, because they don't like to read, but you're actually tricking them into it.
Exactly.
They're not realizing they're,
Yes.
just immersing themselves in this story.
Exactly. And the same kind of passion exists for Sound of Music. I think there's something to be said about the fact that music's, for the past 100 years, I would say, the prevalence of music has been something that defines you. Okay, well, one of the first things that you think about whenever you're meeting somebody new is, okay, well, what kind of music do you like? Well, what kind of movies do you like? And then, if you're, an avid nerd, like, well, what kind of comics do you like? Well, who's your favorite comic writer? Well, who's your favorite comic illustrator? And then it gets, we nip, we chip away at it and everything. But the beautiful thing about it is that yeah, it's something that touches very viscerally on us, something that art just art in general seems to do, is that it defines us as human beings.